Good morning, COM 225 students. We're going to be looking at Chapter 15, and this is Using Words Well. Of course, this is important because as a speaker, you need to use the language and style that is going to be most impactful to your audience. I don't think impactful is a word, so let's just say that will create the biggest impact on your audience. I think that's more in line with what I wanted to say. So if you turn to chapter 15 in your textbook, it's on page 138, and we're going to talk about the oral versus the written language because a lot of students have been trained in writing papers, writing essays, more often than they've been taught how to write a speech. So what's the difference? Well, the oral style and speeches in general should be written using a more personal style. That does have a lot to do with using personal pronouns, we, I, you, things like that that are personal, almost like you're having a conversation with your audience, and that allows you and your audience to interact with one another. Your warmth and contact with the audience affect the overall speech quality and its effectiveness. Oral style, in addition to being more personal, is also less formal. So the big words that you would use in an essay or a written paper are not going to be as effective in a speech. Shorter words and phrases are going to be much better for your overall speech delivery, and they're going to make it easier for the audience to remember what you've said and understand what you've said. Less complex sentence structures, so you don't want a lot of hanging participles, lots of commas, short, simple phrases. Keep it real easy to listen to. And it's also going to be less precise. You may not be able to explain all the nuances in one long sentence. You may have to break it up into shorter sentences. But again, you want the connection with the audience more so than you want to be incredibly detailed about whatever it is that you're speaking on. Oral style is more repetitious, which means we have what? A preview of the main ideas. We develop the ideas in the body, and then we summarize them in the conclusion. The old adage for public speaking and the formula for public speaking is tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So obviously, you're repeating more, and that's something that is desirable, not something that should be avoided. When you're using words effectively, we do want to use specific concrete words. Now, I don't want you to feel like this is actually disagreeing with what I just said, because I did say that we don't want complex sentence structures. We want somewhat of a less precise language, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be specific and concrete. Concrete means I can see it, I can taste it, I can touch it, all of those 5 senses. There's also the ladder of abstraction, and basically what that is there are times when we may say things like, I have a pet. Well, that's very vague. And so if we go up the ladder of abstraction, we start to say, how can I make this more specific? So I have a pet. Well, somebody would say, well, what kind of pet do you have? Well, I have a dog. And then somebody would say, well, what kind of dog do you have? Well, I have a boxer. Well, how old is your boxer? And I would say, he is 3. Oh, well, what's your boxer's name? Gunner. Well, what color is he? Well, he's a fawn, which is a light brown, kind of like Bambi the deer. And so now, what do you have a picture of? You have a picture of a 3-year-old boxer named Gunner, who's the color of a deer and looks like Bambi. Much more precise, much more concrete, much more specific. Use simple words. Again, you don't want to use words that your audience can't immediately understand. We don't want to hear jargon. We don't want to be impressed with your large vocabulary. It's just not the time and place to do so. Use words correctly. You should always know the meaning of words. There's 2 different types of levels of meaning. The one is denotation. The first is denotation, and that's the literal meaning. That means if I look it up in the dictionary, that's going to give me a very clear definition that people can't argue about. That is the definition. The denotation of the word notorious is famous. The connotation, which is the other level that we use when explaining word meaning, is the meaning you associate with the word based on past experiences. So these are the feelings about the word. Notorious connotates fame, resulting from some deed that you did. Famous and notorious are not really interchangeable because famous means you're somebody who's in the public eye, everybody knows about you, whereas notorious, you've probably done something that was not, let's say, lawful. You did something that was against the law. It's not somebody who's famous and liked and admired and adored because maybe they're a celebrity or they're in politics or they're an athlete. Instead, notorious means there's somebody who has done things that are obviously not acceptable legally to society. You should understand grammatical rules and understand that connotation and denotation, but make sure that your grammar's correct. If you have questions about that, you can always have your paper edited at the Writing Center. And the last thing I wanted to say is if you ever don't know how to pronounce a word, you can go to dictionary.com and you can actually play a soundbite of that word being pronounced properly. So in addition to grammatical rules, make sure you pronounce words correctly. Adapting your language style, again, use language that the audience understands. Ethnic vernacular, We have things like Spanglish, which is the combination of English and Spanish, which is usually heard near the United States-Mexico border. Of course, we've got some of those things here in Arizona because we live right there. There's also something called regionalisms, and that means that where you grew up, there may be words or phrases specific to that part of the country. For example, I have a friend who lives in New York, and when I met her, she said that as a little girl, she used to sit out on the stoop. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I was very, very confused. And she said, "Oh, that's your porch." And I said, "Oh, porch, that's something that I know." There's a regionalism. On the West Coast, we would call it the porch. East Coast, they call it the stoop. If I was a California native and I went to the East Coast and I was using an illustration and I used the word porch, that might be confusing to them if they're only familiar with the word stoop. Pop is another one. Soda is another one. Some people call soda pop RC, especially in the South, because that's the only brand that they really like and drink. Jargon, again, specialized language of profession or hobbies. You can use it, but use it sparingly, and when you do use it, make sure that you clearly define what it means. We're using standard U.S. English. That means that any type of slang terms, cliches, they may not be a good idea to put in your speech. We also want to use appropriate language, and that means we don't want to use offensive language. No cursing in any speeches. If there's a curse word in a story, take it out and replace it with something else. Offensive language antagonizes us. Sometimes the way women talk about men can be offensive. Sometimes the way men talk about women can be offensive. Just make sure that even in your stories that there's not offensive language. Derogatory language obviously is going to affect how the audience views you. They're going to view you negatively. So make sure, again, you're not being derogatory towards any gender, culture, or group in society. Unbiased language means that we want to call people servers instead of waitresses. We want to call people flight attendants, not stewardesses. I understand it can get frustrating when people take this to the extreme, but if you want to appear educated and somebody who's aware when you're engaged in public speaking, when you're giving a presentation, use that unbiased language. It doesn't mean you have to use it all the time, although of course it would become a habit and hard to get out of, but you want to come across as credible, and you can't come across credible if you're not using unbiased language. You want to also involve language that is inclusive. I sometimes have a hard time with this because I won't refer to marriage partners. I won't refer to domestic partners. I have a tendency to say husband and wife because that's my situation, and that excludes people. I also may say things like, well, men think this way and women think this way. Well, that again, it excludes people that may not identify with either men or women.